The early morning alarm clock buzzed at 5:30 a.m., but Robert was already wide awake. He had been lying in bed for the past hour, staring at the ceiling with a mix of excitement and nervousness that he hadn't felt since his first deployment overseas. Today was different. Today was special. After 23 years of military service, countless missed birthdays, and more goodbyes than any father should have to say, this day was finally here. His son Michael was graduating from Preston Military Academy, and not just as any ordinary graduate. Michael had earned the title of valedictorian, the highest honor a student could achieve at one of the country's most demanding military preparatory schools. The pride that swelled in Robert's chest was almost overwhelming. All those years of discipline, sacrifice, and leading by example had paid off in ways he could never have imagined. Robert swung his legs out of bed and walked to his closet, where his dress blue Marine uniform hung perfectly pressed. He had spent 2 hours the night before making sure every crease was sharp, every button polished to a mirror shine. The uniform represented more than just clothing to him. It was a symbol of everything he stood for, everything he had worked toward, and everything he hoped to pass on to his son. As he carefully put on each piece of the uniform, memories flashed through his mind. The day he first wore these blues at his own graduation from boot camp, the ceremony where he received his Purple Heart after being wounded in action, the promotion ceremonies that marked his rise through the ranks, and now, wearing this uniform, to watch his son take the next step in what would hopefully be his own distinguished military career. The drive to Preston Military Academy took 45 minutes, but Robert left his house with over an hour to spare. He wanted to arrive early, to take in every moment of this day. The academy was located in the heart of Virginia, surrounded by rolling hills and perfectly manicured grounds that looked like something out of a movie. As he drove through the winding country roads, he couldn't help but think about how different his own childhood had been. Robert grew up in a small apartment in Detroit, raised by his grandmother after his parents weren't able to care for him. Money was always tight, opportunities were limited, and the future often seemed uncertain. The military had saved him, given him direction, purpose, and a way to build a better life. Now watching his son graduate from an elite academy, with a full scholarship to the Naval Academy waiting for him, Robert felt like he had broken a cycle and created something better for the next generation. The gates of Preston Military Academy came into view, and Robert felt his heart rate increase. The entrance was impressive, with tall iron gates, perfectly trimmed hedges, and a security checkpoint that looked more like something you'd see at a government building than a school. As he approached the guard station, he could see other families arriving in expensive cars, dressed in their finest clothes, chatting and laughing as they made their way toward the ceremony area. Robert pulled up to the security window and rolled down his window with a smile. The guard, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, looked him up and down before speaking. Robert handed over his official invitation, the one that had arrived in the mail 3 weeks earlier with the Academy's gold seal and his son's name printed in elegant script. "Good morning," Robert said cheerfully. "I'm here for the graduation ceremony. My son Michael is graduating today." He couldn't keep the pride out of his voice as he added, "He's actually the valedictorian." The guard took the invitation and examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands as if looking for something wrong with it. He glanced back at Robert, then at the invitation again, before finally handing it back. "Park in Lot C," he said, curtly, pointing toward a parking area that seemed much farther from the main building than where other families were parking. Robert didn't let the guard's cold reception dampen his spirits. He parked his car and took a moment to check his reflection in the mirror. His uniform was perfect, his posture straight, and his smile genuine. This was his day, his son's day, and nothing was going to ruin it. As he walked across the academy grounds, Robert took in the impressive sight around him. The buildings were made of red brick and looked like they had been standing for centuries. Students in crisp uniforms walked with military precision, their bearing reflecting the discipline and training they had received. Faculty members in academic robes mingled with families dressed in their finest attire. Everything about the scene spoke of tradition, excellence, and achievement. Robert spotted several other military personnel among the crowd, recognizing them by their posture and bearing even when they weren't in uniform. There were Navy officers, Army personnel, and even a few Air Force members, all there to support their children or grandchildren on this important day. The sight of his fellow service members made Robert feel more at home, reminding him that he belonged here just as much as anyone else. The ceremony was set to begin in an hour, giving Robert time to find his seat and possibly catch a glimpse of Michael before the proceedings started. He had his camera ready, wanting to capture every moment of this milestone. He imagined showing these photos to his buddies back at the base, telling them about his son's achievements and maybe even calling his grandmother to share the good news. As Robert made his way toward the seating area, he noticed the way people looked at him. Some glances were appreciative, recognizing his military service and the significance of his uniform. Others seemed more questioning, as if wondering whether he truly belonged at such a prestigious event. Robert had experienced similar looks throughout his career, and he had learned to hold his head high and focus on what really mattered. The program in his hand showed Michael's name listed as valedictorian, scheduled to give a speech that he had been working on for weeks. Robert had helped him practice listening as Michael talked about service, sacrifice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The young man had wisdom beyond his years, shaped by growing up in a military family and understanding the values that Robert had tried to instill in him. Robert found a quiet spot near the ceremony area and took out his phone to send a quick text to his son. "Dad's here and ready to cheer you on. Proud of you no matter what happens today." He knew Michael would be nervous, despite all his preparation and natural confidence. Public speaking was never easy, especially when addressing such a distinguished crowd. The morning sun was getting higher and more families were arriving by the minute. Robert watched as graduates began to line up in formation, their uniforms spotless and their faces serious with concentration. Somewhere in that group was his son, preparing for one of the most important moments of his young life. Robert's chest swelled with pride as he thought about everything Michael had accomplished to get to this point. The sounds of a military band warming up drifted across the grounds, adding to the excitement and anticipation in the air. Robert checked his watch and realized the ceremony would be starting soon. He began making his way toward his assigned seating area, ready to witness his son's graduation and the beginning of what promised to be an outstanding military career. Robert made his way through the crowd of families, his polished shoes clicking against the stone pathway that led to the ceremony seating area. The academy grounds were buzzing with excitement as parents, grandparents, and siblings found their spots for the graduation. He could hear fragments of conversations around him, proud parents talking about their children's achievements, family members catching up after traveling from different states, and the general chatter that comes with any big celebration. As he walked, Robert noticed how immaculate everything looked. The grass was cut to perfection, the flowers were arranged in precise rows, and even the trees seemed to be positioned exactly where they should be. This place was designed to impress, and it definitely succeeded. Robert felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that his son had thrived in such an environment for the past 4 years. He was about halfway to the seating area when he noticed 2 men in dark uniforms walking in his direction. They weren't academy staff. Robert could tell by their clothes and the way they carried themselves. These were private security guards, the kind that expensive venues hire to make sure everything runs smoothly. Robert didn't pay them much attention, at first assuming they were just doing their regular rounds, but as he got closer, something about their body language made him pause. They weren't just walking around randomly, they were walking directly toward him, and their expressions didn't look friendly. Robert slowed his pace slightly, his military training automatically kicking in. After years of service in various situations, he had developed a sixth sense about when trouble was brewing. The larger of the 2 guards reached him first. He was a big man, probably in his 40s, with the kind of build that suggested he spent a lot of time at the gym. His partner was smaller but looked just as serious. The big guard stepped directly into Robert's path, forcing him to stop walking completely. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his voice loud enough that several nearby families turned to look. "I'm going to need you to leave the premises immediately." Robert blinked, sure he had misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "You heard me," the guard replied, crossing his arms over his chest. This is a private event and you need to go. Now. The confusion Robert felt was genuine and complete. He looked around, wondering if this was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. I think there's been an error, he said calmly, reaching into his jacket pocket. I have an invitation. My son is graduating today. He pulled out the official invitation, the same one he had shown at the security gate just minutes earlier. The paper was thick and expensive, with the Academy's seal embossed in gold. Michael's name was printed clearly as the valedictorian, and Robert's name was listed as his guest. The second guard looked at the invitation but barely glanced at it before shaking his head. Doesn't matter. We've had complaints. Complaints? Robert asked, his voice still controlled, but with a hint of steel creeping in. What kind of complaints? Some of the other families are uncomfortable with your presence here, the first guard said, stepping closer. They've asked us to remove you from the property. Robert felt like he had been punched in the stomach. In all his years of military service, through multiple deployments and countless challenges, he had never felt quite like this. The unfairness of it hit him like a wave, but his training kept him steady. I'm here for my son's graduation, he said, his voice remaining calm despite the storm building inside him. Michael Thompson is the valedictorian. Look, we don't want any trouble, the smaller guard said, though his tone suggested he was prepared for plenty of it. Just leave quietly and nobody has to get upset. By this point, the confrontation had drawn the attention of other families nearby. Robert could feel their eyes on him, could hear the whispered conversations starting around them. Some people looked confused, others appeared uncomfortable, and a few seemed curious about what was happening. The moment was becoming a spectacle, which was exactly what Robert didn't want. I served this country for over 20 years, Robert said, his voice still steady but with an edge that anyone who had served would recognize. I earned my right to be here, and my son earned his place at this academy. The big guard shrugged as if Robert's military service meant nothing to him. That's nice and all, but it doesn't change anything. You're making people uncomfortable, and that's not acceptable at an event like this. Robert felt his hands clench into fists, then consciously relaxed them. Everything in his training told him to stay calm, to not give these men any excuse to escalate the situation further. But everything in his heart was screaming at the injustice of what was happening. Who complained? Robert asked. I'd like to speak with them directly. That's not how this works, the first guard replied. We don't reveal our sources, we just handle the problems. The word problems hung in the air like a slap. Robert understood exactly what these men were saying, even if they weren't being direct about it. After decades of dealing with this type of treatment, he recognized it immediately. The sad part was that it still hurt, even after all these years. More people were gathering now, drawn by the unusual scene of security guards confronting someone in military dress uniform. Robert could see confusion on many faces. Some of the other military personnel in the crowd were starting to pay closer attention, recognizing that something wasn't right about the situation. I'm not causing any problems, Robert said, his military bearing evident in his posture and tone. I'm here to watch my son graduate, that's all. Your presence is the problem, the smaller guard said bluntly. Some folks just don't feel comfortable with you being here. The words hit Robert like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. Years of military discipline had taught him how to maintain his composure, even when everything inside him was in turmoil. He thought about his son, probably getting ready backstage for his valedictorian speech, unaware that his father was being asked to leave. I have every right to be here, Robert said firmly. I have an invitation. I'm the father of the valedictorian, and I'm a decorated veteran of the United States Marine Corps. The larger guard reached for the radio on his belt. Sir, if you don't leave voluntarily, we're going to have to call the police and have you removed. The crowd around them was growing larger now, and Robert could feel the weight of all those eyes on him. He thought about his options, none of which seemed good. He could leave and miss his son's graduation, the moment he had been looking forward to for months. He could refuse to leave and risk being arrested, which would certainly ruin the day for Michael, or he could try to find someone in authority to resolve the situation, though the guards didn't seem interested in talking to anyone else. What Robert didn't know was that the entire confrontation was being watched by a group of men who understood exactly what was happening and weren't going to let it continue. The situation was about to change dramatically, but for now, Robert stood alone, facing down two guards who seemed determined to remove him from his son's graduation day. About 50 yards away from the confrontation, 6 men in perfectly pressed Navy dress uniforms were having their own conversation near the academy's main fountain. They had arrived together, a tight-knit group that moved with the kind of precision and awareness that only comes from years of working as a team in high-stakes situations. These weren't ordinary Navy personnel. The way they carried themselves, the way they constantly scanned their surroundings, and the quiet confidence they projected marked them as something special. Lieutenant Commander Jake Stevens was the unofficial leader of the group, though rank meant less to them than brotherhood when they were off duty. He was here to watch his nephew Tommy graduate, a kid he had helped guide toward military service after Tommy's father died in a car accident 3 years earlier. The other 5 men were his teammates, his brothers in arms, and they had all come to support Tommy on his big day. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez was the first to notice something wasn't right. He had been telling a story about their last training exercise when his attention was caught by raised voices coming from across the courtyard. His head turned slightly, and his eyes immediately locked onto the scene unfolding near the seating area. "Hey, Jake," Rodriguez said quietly, interrupting his own story. "You seeing this?" Stevens followed his teammate's gaze and immediately understood what Rodriguez was concerned about. Even from a distance, it was clear that something was wrong. They could see a man in marine dress blues being confronted by 2 security guards, and the body language of all 3 men suggested the situation was tense. Petty Officer Williams, who had been checking his phone for messages from his wife, looked up and saw what his teammates were focused on. "What's going on over there?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Stevens replied, his voice taking on the focused tone that his team knew meant he was shifting into operational mode. Petty Officer Davis had the best eyesight in the group, and he squinted to get a better look at the situation. That Marine's got ribbons on his chest. Looks like he's been around the block a few times. The team watched as the confrontation continued. They could see the Marine maintaining his military bearing, despite whatever the guards were saying to him. They could also see the crowd of civilians gathering around the scene, most of them looking confused or uncomfortable. "This doesn't look right," Petty Officer Martinez said, his own experience with discrimination making him sensitive to what might be happening. Chief Anderson, the oldest member of the group and a veteran of multiple deployments, had seen enough situations like this to recognize the signs. "Gentlemen, I think we're witnessing something that goes against everything we swore an oath to defend." Stevens made a decision that came naturally to him after years of leading men in difficult situations. "Let's get closer. I want to hear what's being said." The 6 SEALs began moving across the courtyard with purpose, but not in a way that would draw attention to themselves. They had learned long ago how to blend into crowds while still maintaining their awareness and readiness. To most observers, they just looked like Navy personnel walking to find better seats for the ceremony. As they got closer, the voices became clearer. They could hear one of the guards telling the Marine that he needed to leave because his presence was making other families uncomfortable. They could hear the Marine's calm responses, his attempts to show his invitation and explain that his son was graduating. "Did you hear that?" Williams whispered to his teammates. "They're trying to kick out a Marine whose kid is graduating." Rodriguez felt his jaw clench. He had grown up dealing with similar treatment, and seeing it happen to a fellow service member made his blood boil. "That Marine's got a Purple Heart ribbon, you can see it from here." Stevens was studying the Marine more carefully now. The man's uniform was perfect, his posture was textbook military, and his composure under pressure was impressive. Everything about him screamed decorated veteran and proud father. The idea that someone would try to remove him from his own son's graduation was infuriating. "Look at his ribbons," Davis said quietly. "Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Good Conduct Medal. This guy's legit." Anderson was watching the crowd that had gathered around the confrontation. You see how nobody's stepping in to help? They're all just watching like it's entertainment. The team continued to observe as the situation escalated. They could see the Marine becoming more frustrated, though he was still maintaining his military discipline. They could see the guards becoming more aggressive, with one of them reaching for his radio. "They're about to call the cops on him," Martinez observed, his voice tight with anger. Stevens had heard enough. Everything about the situation offended him on multiple levels. As a military officer, he was disgusted by the treatment of a fellow service member. As an American, he was appalled by the obvious discrimination taking place. And as a leader, he knew that sometimes you have to stand up and do what's right, even when it's not your fight. "All right, gentlemen," Stevens said, his voice carrying the authority that had led his team through countless missions. "We didn't come here to watch a good Marine get railroaded at his son's graduation." The other 5 men nodded. They didn't need a long discussion or detailed planning session. They had worked together for years, and they understood each other with the kind of wordless communication that only comes from shared danger and mutual trust. "What's the play?" Rodriguez asked, already knowing that they were going to intervene. "We're going to go have a conversation with those security guards," Stevens replied. "Nothing dramatic, nothing that will cause a scene and ruin the graduation. Just a polite discussion between fellow Americans about treating people with respect." Anderson smiled grimly. "I like the sound of that." As they prepared to move, Williams noticed something else. "Guys, look around. We're not the only military personnel here who've noticed what's happening." It was true. Throughout the crowd, other service members and veterans were starting to pay attention to the confrontation. Some were active duty, others were clearly retired. But all of them were beginning to understand that something unjust was taking place. "Even better," Stevens said. "Looks like that Marine's about to have more support than those guards bargained for." The team began walking toward the confrontation with the same measured, purposeful stride they used when approaching a target. They weren't running, they weren't shouting, and they weren't trying to draw attention to themselves. But anyone who knew how to read body language could see that 6 highly trained warriors were moving with intent. "Remember," Stevens said as they walked, "we're here to support a fellow service member, not to start a fight. But if those guards want to make this about more than just a misunderstanding, well, they picked the wrong day and the wrong Marine to mess with." The distance between them and the confrontation was closing quickly. In just a few moments, the situation was about to change dramatically. The guards had no idea what was coming their way, but the Marine was about to discover that he wasn't standing alone after all. The moment Lieutenant Commander Stevens and his team reached the edge of the crowd, the entire atmosphere began to shift. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but anyone paying attention could feel the change in the air. The 6 SEALs didn't announce themselves or make a big entrance. Instead, they simply began moving through the gathered families with the quiet confidence that comes from years of handling difficult situations. Robert was still facing down the 2 security guards, his military training keeping him calm even as the situation grew more tense. The larger guard had his radio in his hand and was clearly preparing to call for backup or police assistance. The smaller guard was positioning himself to block any attempt Robert might make to move toward the seating area. "Last chance," the big guard said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Leave now or we call the authorities." Robert's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my son's graduation day. That's..." When Stevens stepped forward from the crowd, he didn't push or shove his way through. He simply appeared at Robert's side as if he had been there all along. His presence was commanding without being aggressive, the kind of quiet authority that makes people pay attention without knowing exactly why. "Good morning," Stevens said to Robert, extending his hand with a warm smile. "I couldn't help but notice you're a Marine. I'm Navy, and I just wanted to say it's an honor to meet a fellow service member." The handshake was firm and genuine, the kind of greeting that happens between warriors who recognize something in each other. Robert felt a surge of relief and gratitude that someone was acknowledging him as more than just a problem to be removed. "The honor's mine," Robert replied, his voice carrying more strength than it had moments before. The 2 security guards looked confused by this development. They had been focused on intimidating one man into leaving, and suddenly there was a Navy officer treating that man with obvious respect and recognition. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," the larger guard said to Stevens, trying to regain control of the situation. Stevens turned to look at the guard with the kind of steady gaze that had stared down enemy combatants in hostile territory. "Actually, I think it does concern me. This Marine is here for his son's graduation, just like I'm here for my nephew's graduation. Seems like we have a lot in common." As Stevens was speaking, the other 5 SEALs had positioned themselves around the confrontation. They didn't form an obvious circle or make any threatening moves. They simply found places in the crowd where their presence would be felt. Chief Rodriguez stood slightly behind and to the left of Robert. Petty Officer Williams positioned himself where he could see both guards clearly. The others spread out, in a way that looked natural but effectively surrounded the situation. The smaller guard was starting to look nervous. "Look, we've got our orders. This man needs to leave." "Orders from who?" Stevens asked, his tone polite but with an edge that suggested he expected a real answer. "We've had complaints from other families," the guard replied, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. Anderson stepped forward at that moment, his years of experience evident in his weathered face and the ribbons on his chest. "I'm curious about these complaints. What exactly are people complaining about?" The question hung in the air, and for the first time, the guards seemed to realize they were in over their heads. They had expected to intimidate one isolated individual, but now they were facing multiple military personnel, who clearly weren't going to back down. "His presence is making people uncomfortable," the larger guard said, but even he seemed to realize how weak that sounded. "Uncomfortable how?" Rodriguez asked, joining the conversation. "He's wearing the uniform of the United States Marine Corps with honor. His son is the valedictorian. What exactly is uncomfortable about that?" By this point, other people in the crowd were starting to pay closer attention to what was happening. Some of the civilian families looked confused, not understanding why. Security guards would want to remove a military father from his son's graduation. Other military personnel in the crowd were beginning to move closer, drawn by the sight of the confrontation. Robert looked around and realized that something remarkable was happening. What had started as him standing alone against 2 hostile guards had transformed into something much larger. He wasn't alone anymore. These men, complete strangers who had never met him before today, were standing with him simply because it was the right thing to do. "Gentlemen," Stevens said to the guards, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I think there may be some confusion here. This Marine has every right to be at his son's graduation. In fact, I'd say he's earned that right through his service to this country." Martinez stepped closer to the group, his own military bearing evident. "I notice you haven't actually explained what law or rule he's breaking. Having an invitation and being the father of the valedictorian seems pretty legitimate to me." The guards were starting to look around nervously. What had begun as a simple removal of one troublesome individual had turned into a confrontation with multiple military personnel. They could also see that more people were gathering, and not all of them looked supportive of what the security team was trying to do. "We don't want any trouble," the smaller guard said, which was ironic considering they had created all the trouble. "Neither do we," Stevens replied smoothly. "We just want to make sure a decorated Marine can watch his son graduate without harassment." Davis had been quietly observing the crowd during this exchange, and he noticed something important. "You know what I see?" he said, speaking to his teammates but loud enough for others to hear. "I see a lot of military families here today, active duty veterans, retirees, and I don't see anyone who looks uncomfortable with this Marine being here." The observation was pointed and accurate. Looking around the crowd, it was clear that the military personnel present were supportive of Robert. If there had been complaints about his presence, they certainly hadn't come from anyone who understood military service. Williams decided to be more direct. "So who exactly complained? Because I'd like to talk to them myself." The guards exchanged glances, and it was obvious they didn't have a good answer to that question. The truth was becoming clear to everyone watching. There probably hadn't been any real complaints. This was simply discrimination, pure and simple, And now that it was being called out in front of witnesses, the guards were realizing they had made a serious mistake. An older gentleman in an army uniform stepped forward from the crowd. He was clearly a retired officer, probably a colonel or general based on his bearing and the deference other people showed him. "Excuse me," he said to the guards, "but I couldn't help overhearing this conversation. Are you really trying to remove a Marine from his son's graduation?" The situation was spiraling beyond the guards' ability to control. What had started as intimidating one individual had become a public confrontation with multiple military personnel, and more were joining every minute. The academy grounds, which had been filled with the happy chatter of families preparing for graduation, had become focused on this single moment of injustice being challenged. The moment the retired Army officer stepped forward and questioned the guards' actions, everything changed. It was as if someone had opened floodgates that had been holding back a tide of support. Military personnel throughout the crowd began moving closer, no longer content to simply watch from a distance. These weren't just curious observers anymore. They were fellow service members who recognized an injustice happening to one of their own. A Navy captain approached from the left side of the crowd, her uniform crisp and her bearing commanding. Behind her came an Air Force major, still young, but with the confident stride of someone who had earned her rank through merit. From another direction, a group of Marines who had been attending with their own families started making their way toward the confrontation. The two security guards found themselves in a situation they had never been trained for. What had started as intimidating one isolated individual had become something much larger and more serious. They were now facing what looked like a gathering of some of the most respected members of the military community, all of whom seemed very interested in what was happening. "I think we need to get the academy administration involved," the smaller guard whispered to his partner, clearly out of his depth. Lieutenant Commander Stevens heard the comment and nodded approvingly. "That's actually an excellent idea. I think everyone here would like to speak with someone in authority about what just happened." As if summoned by the mention of administration, a well-dressed woman in academic robes appeared at the edge of the crowd. Dr. Patricia Hamilton was the Academy's Dean of Students, and she had been alerted by faculty members who had noticed the unusual gathering near the ceremony seating. Her face showed concern as she took in the scene before her. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to managing difficult situations. Stephen stepped forward slightly, his military training helping him present the situation clearly and concisely. "Ma'am, these security guards have been trying to remove this Marine from his son's graduation ceremony. The Marine has a valid invitation, his son is the valedictorian, and as far as any of us can determine, he hasn't violated any rules or policies." Dr. Hamilton's face went pale as she processed what she was hearing. Her eyes moved from the guards to Robert, taking in his perfect uniform and military bearing. Then to the growing crowd of military personnel who had gathered in support. "Mr. Thompson?" she said, recognizing Robert from the family photos that had been submitted with graduation materials. "You're Michael's father, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am," Robert replied, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had just endured. The dean turned to face the security guards, and her expression was not pleasant. "Would you care to explain why you were attempting to remove the father of our valedictorian from graduation ceremonies?" The larger guard shifted uncomfortably. "We received complaints about his presence making other families uncomfortable." "From whom?" Dr. Hamilton asked sharply. "I want names and specific details." The guards exchanged glances, and their silence was telling. After a moment, the smaller guard spoke up. "Well, we didn't get specific names, but it was clear that people were concerned." Chief Rodriguez stepped forward, his years of experience giving weight to his words. "Ma'am, I've been watching this entire situation unfold. I haven't seen anyone approach these guards with complaints. What I have seen is a decorated Marine being harassed for no apparent reason." Dr. Hamilton looked around at the faces surrounding her. She saw military officers, veterans, and their families, all of whom looked disturbed by what they had witnessed. She also noticed Academy faculty members at the edge of the crowd, their expressions showing embarrassment and concern. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she said firmly, addressing the guards. "Mr. Thompson is an honored guest at this ceremony. His son has achieved the highest academic honors our academy offers. There is no justification for treating him this way." The transformation that happened next was something that Robert would remember for the rest of his life. Without anyone giving orders or making announcements, the military personnel in the crowd began forming two parallel lines, leading from where Robert stood directly to the front section of the ceremony seating area. It started with Stevens and his SEAL team positioning themselves at the beginning of what would become a pathway. Then the Navy captain and Air Force major took positions across from them. The Marines who had approached earlier filled in behind them, followed by the retired Army officer and his family. One by one, more military families joined the formation. Active duty personnel, veterans who had served decades ago, National Guard members and reserve officers all took their places in line. Some were in uniform, others in civilian clothes, but all of them stood with military bearing and obvious pride. The sight was extraordinary. What had begun as an attempt to exclude and humiliate one man had transformed into a demonstration of the very best values that military service represents. Honor, brotherhood, and standing up for what's right had triumphed over prejudice and discrimination. Dr. Hamilton watched the formation taking shape and felt tears forming in her eyes. In her 20 years at the academy, she had never seen anything quite like this spontaneous show of military solidarity. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice carrying both respect and apology, "would you allow me to personally escort you to your seat? I believe you belong in the front row, where the family of our valedictorian should be." Robert looked down the pathway that had formed before him. Two lines of his fellow service members stood at attention, creating a corridor of honor leading to his rightful place at his son's graduation. The emotion he felt was overwhelming, but his military training helped him maintain his composure. "It would be my honor, ma'am," he replied. As Robert began walking between the lines of military personnel, something beautiful happened. Without any coordination or planning, the service members began to applaud. It started slowly with just a few people but quickly spread until the entire formation was clapping in recognition of a fellow warrior who had been wronged but had maintained his dignity throughout the ordeal. The applause spread beyond the military formation to the civilian families who had been watching. Parents, grandparents, and siblings who had witnessed the injustice felt compelled to show their support. Soon, nearly half the graduation crowd was clapping as Robert made his way to his seat. The two security guards stood off to the side, looking thoroughly ashamed of their actions. Several academy officials had gathered around them, and it was clear that their behavior would be addressed seriously after the ceremony. As Robert reached his seat in the front row, Dr. Hamilton made sure he was comfortably situated before addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that wonderful display of support. It reminds us all of the values that this academy strives to instill in our students." The ceremony was scheduled to begin in just a few minutes, and the military personnel who had formed the honor corridor began making their way to their own seats. But many of them stopped by Robert's seat first, offering handshakes, words of support, and expressions of respect for both him and his son. Lieutenant Commander Stevens was among the last to approach. "Marine," he said, extending his hand one final time, "it was an honor to stand with you today." "The honor was mine," Robert replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone." As the crowd settled into their seats and the graduation ceremony prepared to begin, Robert sat in the front row where he belonged, surrounded by the respect and recognition that his service and his son's achievements had earned. When Michael stepped up to the podium to deliver his valedictorian speech, he would look out and see his father sitting proudly in the place of honor, supported by a community that understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice.